Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always up for a good theological exploration.
Well, today we're wading into a topic that's pretty central to Adventism, but it also, tends to spark some, let's just say, lively debate.
Oh, I know the one. You're talking about the Great Controversy, right?
That's the one.
Definitely a concept that goes way deeper than just your typical good versus evil kind of thing.
Yeah, it really gets into like the very essence of who God is,
Hmm.
his character, his governance, and how all that plays out on this massive cosmic scale.
Absolutely. And the implications are, well, enormous, to say the least.
No kidding. So we've got this excerpt from a book that really dives into the different perspectives that Adventists have on this whole controversy thing.
Always fascinating to see how different people interpret these fundamental ideas.
Right. And especially the role that we humans, you and me, supposedly play in it all. I'm telling you, some of this stuff gets pretty intense.
I bet. So, where do we even begin with something as massive as the Great Controversy?
Well, I think it makes sense to start with, the traditional view,
Mm-hmm.
the one that most Adventists would probably be familiar with, kind of set the stage.
Sure, that's a good approach. So the traditional view basically sets this whole thing up as like a challenge to God's authority, his goodness.
Okay, I'm following. So it's not just like God versus Satan in a, fist fight kind of way.
No, not at all. It's much more subtle than that. The idea is that Satan is accusing God of being unfair, unloving, basically a cosmic dictator.
So like God's on trial in a way and has to prove his innocence.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But here's the key. God could easily squash Satan with sheer power. This isn't a brute force kind of battle.
It's about like proving, demonstrating the truth of God's character through actions, not just words.
Exactly. And that's where the whole biblical narrative comes into play. Satan's rebellion up in heaven, the fall in Eden, God's plan of redemption through Jesus' sacrifice. It's all part of this grand demonstration, this cosmic drama.
Wow, okay, I see where you're going with this. It's like God saying, I'm not just going to tell you I'm good, I'm going to show you through history, through my actions, through my son.
Exactly. So that's the traditional view in a nutshell.
All right, that's a pretty solid foundation.
Yeah.
But this excerpt we're looking at, it also presents an alternative perspective, right? Something called last generation theology,
Hmm.
or LGT.
Yeah. And this is where things get, well, let's say a bit more uh, interesting, shall we say? Maybe even a little controversial for some.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Okay, so LGT basically proposes that a final generation of humans, and get this, absolutely sinless humans, are actually necessary for God to truly win this cosmic battle.
Whoa, hold on a second. So you're saying that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross,
Yeah.
that wasn't enough.
Yeah.
We have to somehow achieve like perfect sinlessness before the second coming.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And as you can imagine, this raises a whole bunch of questions and, well, concerns for some people.
Yeah, no kidding. It seems like a pretty tall order, to say the least. And honestly, it kind of feels like it shifts the focus, from God's power to our own efforts. Like we have to somehow earn our way to victory.
That's definitely one of the criticisms that's been leveled against LGT. And the source we're working with actually quotes another scholar who puts it pretty bluntly. Listen to this. LGT makes God's victory in the great controversy dependent upon the fidelity of mere creatures, thus requiring the view that divine revelation and action are insufficient to win the great controversy, but must be supplemented by human action.
Wow, that's a pretty direct challenge,
Yeah.
to the idea that God is all powerful and that Christ's sacrifice was like the ultimate game changer.
It is, isn't it? So how does LGT even work? Like, practically speaking, how can we as humans achieve absolute sinlessness? Seems kind of impossible, to be honest.
Right. I mean, the Bible's pretty clear that we're all sinners, every single one of us.
Exactly. And the source actually points out that this whole notion of achieving absolute sinlessness really hinges on how you define sin in the first place.
Oh, that's interesting. So, like, what are they saying?
Well, if you define sin as just making wrong choices, then maybe, just maybe, you could somehow train yourself to always choose the right thing, avoid any wrong action. But if sin is something deeper, like a fundamental condition of the human heart, a bent towards selfishness, then it becomes a whole different ballgame.
It's like trying to clean a mud puddle with more mud. you know, you just could keep stirring things up.
That's a great way to put it. And that's basically what critics of LGT argue. Even if we somehow manage to avoid all outward sins, all of the bad actions, there's still this underlying, condition of sinfulness that we can't escape on this side of eternity. at least not according to them.
So it's setting up an impossible standard, basically. And honestly, I gotta say, it makes me a little uneasy.
I understand where you're coming from, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to unpack here.
So we're saying that even if we could, like, pluck off every sinful action, like leaves on a tree, that root system of sin, it's still down there, right?
Yeah. That seems to be the argument, yeah. And like you said, it kind of feels like we're being asked to do the impossible, to be completely weed-free when our very nature, the soil of our being, so to speak, is like prime real estate for those weeds to sprout up.
And this whole, impossible standard thing, it makes me wonder, like, what are the practical consequences of believing this stuff? How does it actually affect the way people live their lives day to day?
Well, one of the concerns that comes up a lot is that LGT can lead to this like spiritual perfectionism, this
Mhm.
constant striving for an unattainable goal. It can be really damaging, to a person's well-being.
It's like you're always looking over your shoulder waiting for the sin police to, like,
Yeah.
bust you for some minor infraction. Exhausting.
It is, and the excerpt actually mentions that because they believed they could achieve this absolutely sinless state if they simply made the right decisions and had to do so in order to have an assurance of salvation in the last days, their failure to achieve this state had devastating consequences for their faith and well-being.
So instead of finding freedom and joy in their faith, they end up feeling trapped, crushed under the weight of their imperfections.
That's the danger. It can create this kind of spiritual paralysis where people are so afraid of messing up, of sinning, that they're hesitant to even, like, try to live out their faith in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it's like they're so worried about spilling the paint
Mm-hmm.
that they never even pick up the brush. They're
Yeah.
never going to create anything beautiful that way. No masterpiece was ever made without, a few drips and splatters.
Exactly. And that's a great analogy because the excerpt actually talks about sin being like a weed. You know how those things are? Even if you pull off all the leaves and stems, those roots, man, they just keep coming back.
Yeah, some weeds, they're practically indestructible. It's
Yeah.
like you think you've gotten rid of them and bam, they're back with a vengeance.
It's like that old saying, nature abhors a vacuum. Something's always going to fill that space. And the source actually says that although God never compels the will, due to the fall, all humans have a sinful nature or bent to sin, which will be discussed further in Martin Hanna's chapter.
Oh, so there's more to come on this whole sin thing, huh? Well, I'm all ears, but I gotta say, right now it feels like LGT is asking us to do the impossible, like become completely weed-free when our very nature is basically like fertile ground for those weeds.
That seems to be a major point of contention, yeah. And the excerpt really highlights how this kind of unrealistic expectation can have some pretty damaging consequences. It specifically mentions that this whole emphasis on achieving sinless perfection can lead to mental health struggles for those who fail to achieve it.
Makes sense. I mean, if you're constantly striving for something that's impossible and feeling like a failure because you can't reach it, that's got to take a toll mentally and emotionally.
Absolutely. It can create this vicious cycle of guilt and shame where people are constantly judging themselves, coming up short, and feeling like they're not good enough. And all this focus on individual perfection, I wonder if it bleeds over into how people relate to others.
That's an interesting thought. Like, if you actually believe you achieve some level of sinless perfection, it's probably pretty easy to become, well, judgmental of others who haven't, reached that level.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. It could create a kind of spiritual hierarchy, which would be pretty harmful to like the unity and fellowship of a community. It definitely doesn't sound very Christ-like, to be honest.
Yeah, it's kind of like, look at me, I'm sinless. What's wrong with all of you?
Right, like the opposite of humility and compassion, which are, kind of at the heart of the Christian message.
So let's get back to the whole great controversy idea. We've been talking about how LGT views human perfection as like essential for God's victory, right? But what does that actually mean? Like, how does this sinless generation supposedly help God win this cosmic battle?
Well, that's where things get a little tricky. LGT proponents often argue that this final generation, the sinless one, will basically provide like the ultimate proof that God's law is perfect and just.
So it's like they're saying, see, Satan, even with all the temptations and craziness of this world, humans can still choose to be perfect. So there.
That's the basic idea, yeah. But the problem, or at least one of the problems, is that it seems to imply that God needs our help, our perfect behavior, to win this battle. Like, he's waiting on us to get our act together before he can claim victory.
Yeah, it kind of makes God sound, well, a little powerless, doesn't it? Like, come on, people, just a little more sinlessness, and I can finally wrap this whole thing up.
Exactly. And that's one of the main criticisms of LGT. It seems to limit God's sovereignty, his ability to act independently. The excerpt actually uses the phrase, God's victory in the great controversy dependent upon the fidelity of mere creatures, which, is a pretty strong statement.
It is, and it brings up another big question. Like, if we can achieve victory over sin on our own, through our own efforts, and what was the whole point of Jesus' sacrifice? Why did he even need to die on the cross?
That's a question that LGT has struggled to answer satisfactorily. And it leads us to another really crucial point, the whole concept of salvation. How does LGT reconcile this emphasis on human perfection with the idea that we're saved by grace through faith?
Yeah, okay, I'm ready to unpack that one. So, does LGT basically say that we have to be perfect to be saved?
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. I mean, for many Christians, most Adventists included, the idea is that justification, being declared righteous by God, is a separate thing from sanctification, the ongoing process of becoming more and more Christ-like. But LGT tends to blur the lines between these two concepts.
So instead of seeing salvation as like this free gift, something we receive through faith in Jesus, it's more about earning it, proving our worthiness through our actions.
That's how some people interpret it, yeah. And that can lead to a lot of anxiety, uncertainty, and even, despair for those who feel like they're just not measuring up, not sinless enough.
Man, that takes all the joy out of being a Christian, doesn't it?
Uh,
Instead of celebrating God's grace, you're just constantly obsessing over your own performance,
yeah.
like you're on this cosmic treadmill trying to outrun your sin. Exhausting.
It is, and that's a far cry from the freedom and peace that Jesus promised his followers.
So where do we go from here? We've explored like the traditional view of the great controversy, and we've dived into the complexities and honestly some of the challenges of LGT. Like, what does all this mean for us, for our everyday lives? How do we actually apply this stuff?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that the great controversy, at its core, it's a battle for like our hearts and minds. It's a
Yeah.
choice that we're making every single day to align ourselves with God's will or to, go our own way.
So it's not just this abstract theological debate. It's about how we actually live our lives, how we treat others, make decisions, face challenges.
That's exactly right. And the source we're working with, it does a good job of reminding us that this isn't just about ideas, it's about real people, real lives, real struggles. Like, remember those examples of individuals who suffered because they felt like they couldn't achieve this, impossible standard of sinless perfection?
Yeah, that's what makes this whole conversation, so important. It's not just about getting lost in these like intellectual arguments and theological jargon. We have to think about the human impact, like how these beliefs actually affect people, their emotional and spiritual well-being.
I couldn't agree more. And that brings us back to, one of the core issues with LGT, this potential to foster a sense of fear and inadequacy instead of like the joy and freedom that should be at the heart of a life in Christ.
Yeah, like instead of experiencing God's grace, you're stuck in this pressure cooker of expectations, constantly worried about failing, about not being good enough, measuring up.
And that's just so far removed from the message of, unconditional love and acceptance that we see in the Gospels. Remember how Jesus, he reached out to the outcasts, the sinners, the people who knew they were messed up and needed help. He didn't demand perfection. He offered forgiveness and healing, no strings attached.
It's like the difference between, a super demanding coach who only cares about winning and a compassionate mentor who genuinely wants to see you grow and thrive, even if you like stumble and make mistakes along the way.
That's such a great analogy, and it really highlights this crucial point.
Oh.
Our worthiness isn't based on our performance. It comes from God's love for us. We don't have to earn our way into his favor. We're already accepted and loved just as we are, flaws and all.
Okay, so if we kind of zoom out a bit, step back from all the specifics of LGT, what are some like practical takeaways from our deep dive into the great controversy? What does all this mean for us, for our everyday lives, walking around in the world kind of stuff?
Well, I think it's important to remember that we're not just passive bystanders in this whole, cosmic drama. We actually have a role to play, a choice to make about which side we're on.
Right, like we talked about earlier, it's about aligning ourselves with God's will, choosing love over selfishness, grace over legalism. But like, how do we actually do that? Sometimes it feels so overwhelming, like where do we even begin?
That's a great question, and I think it comes down to, taking those big concepts and translating them into concrete actions. The excerpt we've been discussing actually emphasizes our role as witnesses, sharing the good news of God's love, reflecting his character to the world through the way we live our lives.
So it's not just about, like, believing the right things in our heads. It's about letting those beliefs flow out into our actions, showing the world what God's love looks like in practice.
Exactly. It's about being kind and compassionate, forgiving and generous, standing up for justice, speaking truth to power, even when it's hard. It's about, letting our lives be a testament to the transformative power of God's grace, what it can do in us and through us.
It's like being the hands and feet of Jesus, bringing healing and hope to a world that's, well, pretty messed up in a lot of ways.
Beautifully said. And that leads us to another really important aspect of this whole conversation, one we didn't get to dive into as deeply as I'd hoped, the whole delay of the second coming. LGT has a very specific take on this, suggesting that the reason Jesus hasn't returned yet is because he's waiting for that sinless generation to, finally emerge.
Well, hold on. So they're basically saying that it's our fault, humanity's fault,
Hmm.
that Jesus hasn't come back yet. Like, we're holding God's timetable hostage with our imperfections.
That's the implication, yeah. And it's definitely one that many people find, well, troubling, to say the least.
Yeah.
It puts a lot of pressure on humanity and it seems to, limit God's sovereignty.
It almost sounds like they're saying, hurry up and be perfect, people, so Jesus can finally get here.
It does, doesn't it? And it's just really hard to reconcile that perspective with, the biblical emphasis on God's grace, his patience, his desire for all people to come to repentance and experience his love.
Right. So maybe the delay, it's not about God waiting for us to reach some impossible standard of perfection,
Right.
but more about, giving us more time, more opportunities to turn to him, to experience his love and grace, to grow and change.
That's definitely a more, well, hopeful and empowering perspective, isn't it? It shifts the focus away from our performance and back onto God's character, his loving purpose for humanity.
And it reminds us that, God is working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it, even when things don't make sense to us. He's orchestrating events, guiding history according to his perfect plan and his perfect timing.
And ultimately, that's where our faith comes in, right? Trusting in God's goodness and faithfulness, even when things are tough, even when we don't understand.
Well, this has been quite the journey, exploring the great controversy and all the different ways we, as Adventists, approach this, central tenet of our faith. It's definitely given me a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Me too. And I hope it's encouraged our listeners to do the same, to, really engage with these ideas, wrestle with the tough questions, and ultimately come to a deeper understanding of God's character and his plan for our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there like one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something to kind of, ponder as they go about their day?
I think it goes back to that idea of hope, even in the midst of all the, uncertainties and complexities of this whole great controversy thing. We have this incredible promise: God wins. And in his victory, we find our own. So let's hold on to that hope, cling to God's promises, and, really try to live each day as a testament to his amazing love and grace.
That's a great place to end. It's been a privilege exploring these, profound truths with you. And to all of you listening out there, thanks for joining us on this incredible adventure. Until next time, may God's grace and peace be with you all.